We start by traveling to the Lakeside Community Center in Ankeny, Iowa. Last week, Senator Bob Dole held a town meeting at the center as part of his campaign for the Republican Party's nomination for president.
Next President of the United States, Mr. Bob Dole.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be in Ankeny, and I've been taking stock in Ankeny for some time, and so let me back away a little bit. So I'm happy to be here again. And I didn't realize that you had such a large press corps in Ankeny until I arrived this morning. So there are people I haven't seen for some time. They've been off on vacation, members of the press, resting up while we've been out working. Now they're ready, their pens are sharp and their minds are sharp, and they're ready to descend on all of us poor candidates who are out here. And they'll have a chance this evening, I guess, for about 6 of us. But let me say at the outset that it's a pleasure to be one of those candidates, and it's a privilege to be one of those candidates. And now we're getting down to the time where we need to make the sale. We need to close the deal. A lot of us have been all over this state. I've been in each of the 99 counties. Well, that's me and Elizabeth have been in each of the 99 counties. I think I've been in 70-some, and she's been in 40-some, and some many, many times, and of course Polk County many, many times. And I've been doing this, for several months. And I've been trying to deliver a message in the state of Iowa, as well as the state of New Hampshire and the state of South Dakota and Minnesota and other early states. And it'll be the same message as we progress in the campaign. And the message that I've been trying to deliver is that I believe the American people, regardless of their party, Democrat or Republican or Independent, are looking for strong leadership starting in 1989, after Ronald Reagan, post-Reagan era, someone who can make a difference, someone who understands the Congress and someone who understands the government and someone who can get results. And I've said nearly at every stop, I'm a Republican, I'm proud of it. And the bottom line, as far as I'm concerned, is that we keep the White House Republican. And I've tried to make that clear everywhere I've gone. And if it can't be me, maybe it'll be some other well-qualified Republican. But we're getting to the stage now where people want to ask us the questions of why you? Why not someone else? And is there a difference with the Republican candidates? And I think there is. And if I know people in Iowa, or if I know people who've moved to Iowa like Carl has from Kansas, but if I know this part of the country as I believe I do, I'd like to think that I understand that the people in this state, whether they're young as I have on my left or in their early 30s as I have on my right, come to think of it, in addition to strong leadership, they're looking at our character, our honesty, our integrity, what we've done, what we haven't done, what we should have done, and what we're all about. Now, I'm not a perfect candidate. Never said I was. Don't know all the answers. Never said I did. And I've made mistakes, and I've made a lot of votes, and I've made a few I'd like to recall myself, but it's too late. It's on the public record. And as I've said to some in this audience before, there's nothing very complicated about Bob Dole. I believe I have small-town traditional values and Washington experience, and that's a pretty good combination. I am from Russell, Kansas, and I'm proud of it. I did go to public schools in Russell, Kansas, and I'm proud of going to public schools. I am the only one of 4 children who got a college education in the Dole family, and I'm proud of that. And I got it largely because of the GI Bill of Rights after World War II, and there may be 1 or 2 in this audience who had the same good fortune. And I got into politics almost by accident, not because it was in the family or we were looking for power or anything of that kind. I got into politics after World War II. I went back to Russell, Kansas after about 39 and a half months in and out of hospitals, back to my hometown to sort of hide and get away. I didn't want anybody to see me or anything else, because I left that little town weighing about 194 pounds and came back weighing 122. But that was irrelevant. But I remember when I got there, one of our good, fine citizens, Clifford Holland, who was a Democratic leader in my little hometown, came by to see me. Came by our home to see me. He said, "Bob, you ought to get into politics. I think you may have a future in politics." And I said, "I don't know anything about politics." He said, "Doesn't make any difference." He said, "You got shot, and I think we can get you elected." Now that to me wasn't much of a qualification. So we had a very nice visit, and he was a very fine man, and his sons still live in Russell, Kansas. And I remember a little later, and I may have exaggerated this story a bit, but I remember later talking to one of the Republican leaders named John Wolk, who's still a practicing lawyer in Russell, Kansas, a friend of mine. And he knew that I'd talked to Clifford Holland. He said, "Bob, now you ought to get into politics, but you ought to be a Republican." And he gave me a lot of reasons, but he finally said, "Now the bottom line is that there are twice as many Republicans in Russell County as Democrats." So I made a great philosophical judgment. I decided to become a Republican, and I'm proud of it. I think I made the right choice. But the point is, like a lot of people in this room, politics was not my life. I hadn't even thought about it. But there was an opportunity, and I ran for the legislature, and I got elected. Then I ran for county attorney against about 6 lawyers in my hometown in 8 years. We only had 10, I guess. And I kept getting elected. And the point I would make to this audience is that I kept learning as I went along. I didn't know very much about politics, didn't know much about people. I'd never thought much about disabled Americans. I'd never thought much at all, I guess. I was young and healthy and thought, why should I worry about anybody? Let them worry about me. It's my future. But I'd like to think as I stand here today that I'm a strong person, that I'm a sensitive person, and much of what I've learned has been coming up the chairs or going up the ladder in politics. I remember as county attorney in our little county, we didn't have many criminal cases. It was a nice, quiet, law-abiding community. I remember a couple of times having to take children away from their parents, and that leaves an impression that doesn't go away very soon. I remember every month as county attorney having to go down the welfare list and sign my name at the bottom saying these people are qualified to receive public assistance, and finding my grandparents on that list. And they were old and they were poor. They weren't lazy, but they'd been farmers, tenant farmers, and they'd lost a farm. And nobody else had enough money to help them. And what I'm suggesting is this. If I know anything about America, and if I know anything about the American people, oh yeah, we're looking for leadership and we're looking for this, and we want to know about this program and that program and that program. But again, I think if I understand the American people, they want someone in the Oval Office who might be able to empathize with them. And so as I've been coming to Iowa, and as I've been listening to Chuck Grassley introduce me from time to time, and as I've been listening to Senator Grassley say, we ought to be for Bob Dole because he's one of us. And I think that's important. I'd like to think that somebody in this audience, or nearly everyone in this audience, can sort of identify with Bob Dole. Not many of us started at the top and stayed at the top. Most everyone in this audience got there the hard way. Most everyone in this audience had to climb up the ladder, with a lot of help from their friends. And that's where the real America is, and that's where the real Americans are. And that's why Iowa is so important. And make no mistake about it, this is an important, critical state in the primary process for Republicans and Democrats alike. If you drew a political map of the United States for 1988, and the size of the states were determined by their political impact, Iowa would take up 40% of the country, New Hampshire 40%, and the rest of the states maybe together 20%. And that's why I've been to Iowa, I think, 42 or 3 times in the last 12 months. And that's why we've been in every county. And that's why we're going to continue to work up until caucus night. So that's why I'm a candidate. That's why I come to Iowa. That's why I ask for your support. And I happen to believe the single biggest threat to America is the federal deficit. And it's not going to go away, and it's not going to grow away. It's going to require leadership and support of the American people. And I'm not talking about gloom and doom or devastation. I'm talking about belt tightening, starting with the federal government. And it doesn't have to be all that, draconian. Just let the American people know that it's fair, that it's across the board, no exception except for low-income Americans, and I believe it will be accepted. Maybe it's a spending freeze. That might be a good place to start. An across-the-board spending freeze with some exceptions for low income, and that's all. We missed a good opportunity on October 19. We had a golden opportunity, the Congress and the President, to take bold action to deal with the deficit, but we didn't do it. We frittered away a couple of weeks, and then the time was passed. And we ended up squabbling with each other. We can't do this, we can't do that, and now we're told in the morning's paper that maybe we're going to be $30-some billion short, and maybe the deficit reduction package is not going to have any impact at all. So I would say to this audience that the first item on the Dole agenda in 1989 is going to be sitting down with Republicans and Democrats, leaders in the Congress, and working out a deficit reduction package to keep the economy going, keep the economy expanding, more jobs, more opportunities in the private sector. And we can do that without raising your taxes. We don't need to raise tax rates. We took a lot of things away from a lot of people in this audience in the 1986 tax reform bill, and we said, don't worry about it, it's good for you because we're going to lower your rates. And now we have some, after you've lost your investment tax credit or your sales tax deduction or whatever it may be, saying, now we got to raise your rates again. And we can put together a package that the American people will accept. So I would just say, before I respond to questions, that as far as I'm concerned, that's got to be the top item on my agenda, and will be the top item on my agenda. As I've said before, it's public enemy number one. We have to deal with it. And I saw in a New York Times poll yesterday that 54% of the Iowans, 54%, list the federal deficit as the most important problem. The next closest was 19% for something. So the Iowans are in step with what needs to be done. Oh yes, we've got a trade deficit. We've got a lot of concerns about economic development. We talked briefly with some earlier on that this morning. We're concerned about agriculture, whether we live in Iowa or whether we live in town or in the farm or wherever. We're concerned about foreign policy. We're concerned about Nicaragua, the Soviet Union, the Intermediate-Range Missile Agreement. Those are all concerns. But the bottom line is dealing with the deficit, creating more job opportunities, better educational possibilities for the young people here. And I can promise you that's precisely what I'll deal with when elected president. let me just say one other thing. I happen to think I'm going to be the Republican nominee, and I say that in the most appropriate way I can. I feel very confident about the future. I'd like to think when Bob Dole has served as president, there are a lot of things that are going to be different. We're going to build on the Reagan record. We're going to do what we can to create more opportunities, whether it's in the private sector, whether it's in education, whether it's in agriculture, whether it's in rural development, whether it may be in foreign policy. There are a couple of words I use in my announcement speech that I think sort of sum it up. The first was opportunity, and I just talked about some of those, and the second was security. Security in our jobs, security in our homes, security in our country. That's what I'm looking ahead and looking forward to as I continue to campaign across the country. So I would ask you, as I've said many times before, so I don't forget it, if there's some who haven't made a commitment, some are still trying to make a decision, I want to make certain you understand that I want your vote and I need your help. We have a very tight race in this state. It's going to be a very close race. I want to win, others want to win, only one of us will win. And I was here in 79 and 80, I know how it works the other way. I met a lot of nice people when I campaigned here in 79 and 80, and a lot of them said, Bob, you're a nice guy, but I'm for somebody else, and you ought to come back later. Well, I remembered that, and I'm back, and it's later, and a lot of people who told me that then are now working for Bob Dole. We have an outstanding organization in this state, second to none. We're organized in every county and nearly every precinct in this state. We've got hundreds and hundreds and thousands of good people, real people all across this state who are working for my candidacy, and I thank you for that. So I want to just introduce one person here who's running my campaign, then I'll respond to questions. Bill Brock was a former Secretary of Labor, former U.S. Trade Representative, former colleague of mine in the United States Senate from the state of Tennessee, first Republican elected there in a long, long time. Bill Brock is in Des Moines today, and he's running the Dole effort. Bill, why don't you stand up so you can see Bill Brock back there. Yes, sir.
Senator, what do you think we should do with the balance of trade problem that we've got?
I'll repeat the question so in case you don't hear it. What should we do with the balance of trade problem we have? I think very honestly that the first thing we have to do is to deal with the federal budget deficit. We've got to demonstrate to our friends around the world, because they keep complaining about it, whether the British or the French or the West German or the Japanese, that we haven't dealt with our deficit. So the first thing we need to do is to deal with the deficit. And I think we can do that. I think the American people and the Congress and a new president, all pulling in the same direction, are going to get it done. Secondly, we've got to be more aggressive. We've got to have our friends understand, whether the Japanese or the West Germans or wherever they might be, that it's a two-way street. It's a two-way street. We believe in access. We believe in open markets. It's good for our American consumers. We don't want to build a wall of protectionism around America. But at the same time, if some countries' citizens have access to our markets with their products because they're competitive, okay. But we ought to have access to their markets where our people are competitive. And maybe it's made in Ankeny, maybe it's made somewhere else. But if we've got a good competitive product, why can't we get into the Japanese market? And we're not going to accept from the Japanese anymore. They have about a plan a year saying how we're going to open up our markets. And I'll give you one little clue where I'm coming from. I don't support the Gephardt Amendment. Dick Gephardt's a fine fellow. But it smacks of protectionism. If you can't negotiate in 6 months, then the tariffs and import quotas. But last year when the trade bill was on the Senate floor, Senator Byrd and I offered a leadership amendment. It was actually Senator Byrd and Dole, he's the leader now, which said this: if we find a persistent pattern of unfair trade practices and we can't get any relief, and the President of the United States refuses to act, then the Congress can take initiative through one of two committees, and there are a whole host of remedies. So we've got to be more aggressive, we've got to be very competitive. We're spending a lot of money on research and development through the tax code. We can't always blame some other country. Sometimes it's our fault. Sometimes we're not competitive. And I also support, with some reservations, the U.S.-Canadian Free Trade Agreement. We need to be in a position. We'd like to get Mexico involved too. So we could go to the European Economic Community with some leverage, say, oh, we've got a North American group. And it's a big, big trade agreement with the Canadians. We've got a few rough spots to work out, but generally it's a step in the right direction. Yes?
How can you feel comfortable with your tenants of the distraction, take care of everything?
The question is, how can we feel comfortable? I think I heard it all with the INF agreement, the missile agreement with the Soviets, and what was the last part? It's not a... How can we be sure it's not a distraction to cover up something else that may be going on? Well, I must say that, as I've said before, the treaty process is a two-stage process. It's like a two-stage rocket. The first stage is negotiation. That took about 3 years, and the signing ceremony took about 20 minutes. That's the first stage. That's been completed. The second stage, according to Article 2, Section 2 of the Constitution, is up to the United States Senate to advise and consent on the treaty. That process will start on January 25, and I'll be one of the first witnesses supporting the treaty. But during that process, you're going to hear from a lot of people, not just politicians or presidential candidates. You're going to hear from experts who've examined the treaty very carefully, who understand the world nuclear arms race and the role of NATO and conventional weapons and ICBMs, the larger ones, and all that. Men and women like Henry Kissinger and Jeane Kirkpatrick and others who are experts in their field. And they're going to make a record. And after the record is made, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee will send that treaty to the Senate, and I assume after extensive debate it's going to be ratified by a wide, wide margin. So that's that's sort of the precautions we take. You don't have a treaty just with the President's signature. It's got to come to the Senate, and our founding fathers are pretty smart. Most of the senators have not yet taken a position. As I think back on it, I think I was fussed at by somebody for not jumping on board immediately before I'd even read the treaty. But I wanted to check it out, and I wanted to talk to the experts, and I did. I talked to Henry Kissinger. I met with Jeane Kirkpatrick. I talked with former President Nixon, who's celebrating his 75th birthday today, by the way. I talked to Margaret Thatcher. I'd placed a call to Margaret Thatcher. Didn't know whether she'd take it, but apparently she had seen the Iowa polls. And so I got to talk to Margaret Thatcher. And besides, the British bookies are betting that I'm going to be the nominee. So, maybe, I don't think she didn't get, in the paper it was. She didn't get it from the bookies. And then I talked to Helmut Kohl, who also took my call. I talked about 18 or met with 18 different people, experts. Former NATO Commander Bernie Rogers, who happens to be a fellow Kansan, he's got a lot of doubts about the treaty. General Scowcroft got a lot of doubts about the treaty. But most of them say, I've got doubts about it, but it's going to be ratified. We ought to be concerning ourselves with the next one. And we ought to make certain the next thing we do with the Soviet Union is reduce their superiority in conventional weapons. That's going to be the next big thing. So I think there are enough safeguards. And the Senate can always add little things to the treaty, and probably will, to make certain that the U.S. position is clearly understood. And I think the question came from precisely the right place. How old are you? 15. See, it's really his future. It's his future. And he ought to be concerned about a good agreement. It's going to take 3 years to implement it. He's going to be about 18 then. And maybe we'll have another treaty by then. But we've got to make certain. That's why we examine it so carefully. That's why we make certain what it is before we're out cheerleading for it. Because it's his future. And America's future. And I'll just make you one promise. In the Senate this year, I'll try to protect your interest. And most of this treaty is going to be implemented under the next president. If I'm president, I'll protect your interest. I said in the past, I don't trust Gorbachev. I didn't mean that in a hostile way. He doesn't trust us either. When we deal with the Soviet Union, it's got to be because it's in our interest. Because that's the only way they're going to deal, if it's in their interest. But we continue the dialogue. We continue to try to make relationships better with the Soviet Union and the United States, and Gorbachev's a very key player. And I want to get to know him better. I want to sit down across from him before too long and talk to him about a lot of things. So I think we're going to be well protected. Yes, ma'am.
Senator, if you were elected president, what are some of the principles you would use to elect a new Supreme Court judge if the opportunity arose?
Well, there'll probably be some opportunities for the next president to maybe name 2 or 3 Supreme Court justices. It's probably one of the most important, if not the most important nomination a president makes. And you shouldn't impose any preconditions except this. I want somebody who practices judicial restraint, who is a conservative in the broad sense, who doesn't want to be a legislator, who wants to be a judge, who wants to interpret the law, someone who wants to read the Constitution, not read something into it. If they want to be legislators, they ought to run for Congress or the state legislature. And there are a lot of well-qualified men and women in this country. I want to get the best possible people, men or women, to sit on the United States Supreme Court. You know, we're a 3-headed government. They're a very important part of it. And some are in, you know, they're getting in the years where they may want to retire. So I would just say someone who also has had some experience, maybe on the circuit court. I don't want them to have written too many articles. Somebody said the only way you're ever going to get the Supreme Court justice satisfies the present Judiciary Committee and the Senate is to, as soon as somebody is born, lock them up in an isolation booth until they're old enough to be on the court. But I don't think we have to go that far. Judge Kennedy, in my view, and that's going to come up the next month, is going to get a big, big vote of confidence. Judge Bork should have been confirmed. Judge Bork was a highly qualified nominee, but he went down in flames, but he saved the process. So we owe a great deal to Judge Bork. Judge Ginsburg, you know, maybe he shouldn't have been nominated. But Judge Kennedy should have been, and he's got a good record. Had a 3-day hearing is all it took. He's going to be confirmed by a wide margin in the Senate. Yes. The question is a very important one because, again, we're looking at the future of America over here. 15 years, 16 years of age, they're getting ready to go to college. They're going to graduate from high school. Then they've got to sit down with somebody, and probably already doing that with their parents or somebody. How am I going to go to college? I'll bet there got to be 1 or 2 or 3 in that group of 20 over here that got to have some help. I've got to believe that education is almost the top priority. You know, I've talked a lot about Bill Brock. I've talked a lot with Bill Brock about what's going to happen as he learned as Secretary of Labor if we don't start making certain that the young people who graduate are equipped to take on the jobs after the year 2000, 2010. We're going to have a lot of vacancies, but nobody to fill the vacancies unless we return to basics, math, science, physics, computer technology, unless we do what we can to make certain you get the best possible education. You know, we spent about $308 billion on education in 1986. That's nationwide, state, local. About 6.5% of that came from the federal government, slightly over $20 billion. But of that $20 billion, $2 billion is what we call Pell Grants, and there are other student loan monies. There's not going to be any effort in a Dole administration to undermine the opportunity somebody looking for if they can't find it anywhere else. What I don't want in any administration is a program that was so loose as it was 8 or 10 years ago that a lot of people, a lot of parents who didn't even need the assistance could borrow the money, put it in the bank, and draw interest on it. That's not what programs are designed for. We want a program to make certain that some young man or young woman who otherwise would be denied an education, it doesn't have to be a 4-year education either. Maybe it's a 2-year education. Maybe it's a vocational school. You don't have to go to a 4-year college to be a success in America. So we're going to make certain that we have these programs properly targeted to take care of the demand for the people who otherwise would be shut off. And again, I would say I'm a product of that. I'm not certain I could have gone to college, attended college without the GI Bill of Rights. I got a lot of advantages in that program after World War. I had a left-handed typewriter. I took a recording machine to class with me, plugged it in every morning. I had the best notes in class. I could have taught the course. I didn't like it, though, but I could have taught it. So I had a lot of breaks. Plus, they paid enough money where you could live. So we'll have a program. And I think you need to go back and look over at some of the budget's been submitted by the present administration where they made rather drastic cuts in education. And I think also have an understanding, having attended public schools, of just what it's all about. And I've met a lot of people, young people, as you'll meet in public schools, who have to worry about how they're going to get to college. So we'll have a good program. Yes?
My name is Nancy DeBoer, and I'm referring to from Belgium. And I would like to know about measles in Belgium. You know, you're not.
Now, give me a little more information. You're doing very well, though. I mean,
What do you think about the fact that we have measles if you don't have any?
well, let me just state it this way. I think we have to be very careful about what we call the neutralization or denuclearization of Europe. I know a lot of people out there marching and demonstrating and doing a lot of things saying, get rid of all nuclear weapons, and that's fine if everybody else in the world would, and we can make certain we could verify it and a lot of other things. And we ought to get rid of it, maybe all conventional weapons too, and then we have a perfect world. But it's not going to happen. And it gets back to the basic point I made a few moments ago. We've got to make certain that any deal we make with the Soviets is in our interest and also in our allies' interest. And I must say, I think our allies were a little shaken at Reykjavik. I think they felt they weren't consulted. And that's one reason I want to make a couple of phone calls, and I also met with the Prime Minister of Italy to see if they really strongly supported the Reagan-Gorbachev agreement. But there is some concern, particularly in West Germany, now that you're going to take out the Pershings, that took so much trouble to get them in, are they going to be sort of left naked if we don't have some conventional balance worked out with the Soviet Union? So I think we just have to be very careful, one agreement at a time. We've got one on the table. The President's going to go to Moscow in June. I know there's a lot of interest in maybe getting a second agreement this year, maybe even getting it ratified in 1988. I don't see that that's possible. So I think we have to be very, very careful. And we're talking about freedom. That's the bottom line. I'm not talking about Gorbachev or Reagan or Bob Dole or anybody else. We're talking about freedom. Our freedom. Your freedom. And we're not going to bargain that away. Oh, yes. Give me a card, Tom. No, go ahead.
Mr. President, what do you think of the United Nations? What it costs us? Do we get any benefit from the monies that are spent in the United Nations? I personally think it's very small.
Do we get any benefit? Well, probably there's some there. But, you know, we have been picking up most of the tab. And I must say, through the efforts of my colleague, Senator Kassebaum, we've reduced that, quote, contribution to the United Nations substantially over the past 3 years. I think the UN serves some purpose. It's a sounding board. You can blow off a lot of steam there. We have had some success just recently when we had both the Soviets and the United States agreeing on what Iran might do on a ceasefire. Iran hasn't signed it yet, but at least Soviets didn't veto the plan. So I think there's still some opportunities there, but I think it's heavily laden with bureaucracy. Far too many people working there at high salaries. I mean, I know how sensitive Iowans are to my salary in the Congress. You ought to look at some of the salaries at the UN. And you're paying for part of those. And there are probably a lot of good people. So I think we have to be very careful, and we have to make certain that we scrutinize that budget like we scrutinize everything else. I wouldn't abolish it, but I wouldn't try to make it much fatter either. I'd try to make it leaner and more responsive. So I think we've had some success. I think General Walter's doing a good job. I think Gene Kirkpatrick did an outstanding job. So we've had some success in the United Nations, but not much. Let me just take one more question, then I'm...
Senator Dole, under your administration, what was the United States' priority in space?
Under my administration, what our priority be in space? Want to go ahead with the manned space station, try to get that funded. We're going to run out of funds in June. The second is to keep in mind that we're never going to lose our technological edge to the Soviet Union in space or anywhere else if we can avoid it. That's what's kept us ahead the last 20, 30, 40 years. And now we're finding the Soviets getting ahead of us in certain areas of space. They haven't been to the moon yet, but there are other areas they can point to where they've made more progress. So we just have to keep, again, keep our eye on the budget, keep our eye on who the contractors are. But there are a lot of useful, peaceful means of space that we can use in this country. When you're 25, 30 years of age out here running for Congress, they're going to be very helpful. And let me again focus on the importance of supporters going to the caucus. It's not just walking in and voting. It's going to the caucus. And I know it's an evening. It's probably going to be cold, and you just had a nice warm dinner. Then you remember some guy wants you to go out to a caucus. Now, if you're not for me, don't worry about going out to the caucus. Stay inside where it's warm. Watch your favorite TV program. But the Dole people have to have that intensity factor so great, they'll climb through the drifts to get to the caucus. And why should you do that for Bob Dole? Because I've made a difference. I made a difference in Social Security in 1982 when it was insolvent. We put together a package in '83. Now we got $70 billion surplus, and I was chairman of the Finance Committee, a member of the Commission. And I made a difference in 1985 when farmers were falling like flies in the Midwest. They were going broke, and nobody had any hope, and nobody seemed to care. And we put together a farm bill that's having a big, big impact. It's so big that the Wall Street Journal said last week that the farm problem is no longer, the farm issue is not out there anymore. It's just a problem. It's not a crisis. And I made a difference in 1981 and subsequent years on tax bills. We're trying to lower the rates for working men and women. And the biggest single, in my view, the most important provision in all the tax bills in Ronald Reagan's administration was tax indexing, which was not in the Reagan package in 1981. It was offered as a floor amendment by Senator Bob Dole and Senator Bill Armstrong. And what is tax indexing? I'll tell you what it is. If you got a job out there and you get a cost of living increase, you don't get tossed into a higher tax bracket because we adjust the brackets. We index the brackets. Yes, and I've made a difference in some programs that don't affect anybody here. Maybe it's food stamps. Maybe it's WIC. Maybe it's a school lunch program. Or maybe it's even animal welfare or voting rights or foreign policy. And I'll be leading the efforts for Ronald Reagan to get the INF agreement ratified. I'm a leader. The American people want leadership. And I've got a record that I think will stand up against scrutiny from anybody else. And I'm willing to stack it against anyone else's record. I can work with Congress. I can work with Democrats. I can work with Republicans in the Congress, and I have. That's what I do every day. And I want to be your president. Not because I just want to be your president, because I think we want to get some things done in America, and I believe I can do it. And I didn't reach that judgment lightly either. We've got a lot of problems in America. And the government can't solve every problem. We can't guarantee success. We can't guarantee you're not going to fail in America. But I think most Americans want somebody at the helm who's at least experienced a little bump along the way. Somebody who knows how to sit down and talk to people who haven't made it. Somebody who can sit down and talk to somebody in a wheelchair, somebody who can't talk or can't walk and not be embarrassed by it. Somebody who knows the strength of America is in its people all over America. But you're going to make the judgment. You don't know maybe how important your vote is. What happens in this state could start a prairie fire all across America. And somebody says, well, the system is not fair. You shouldn't have Iowa the first state and New Hampshire the second state. And I've been asked about it. I said, no, you ought to have Kansas the first state. But the system works the way it works. So if you can help us, I'd like to have you fill out this card. I can only promise you two things, then I'll stop. One, I work hard. 1987 was a big year in Iowa. There are a lot of meetings that I'd like to have attended in Iowa in 1987, but I had a job. I was getting paid good money to be a senator from Kansas. And the people of my state are pretty much like the people of this state. We get paid, we ought to work. So when I finished 1987, when the Congress left, I had a 95% voting record. I'd missed 16 votes in 1987, 6 of those attending a funeral of former Senator Carlson, but only 10 because I was out campaigning for Bob Dole. So I promise you I'll work at what I do. If you want to check on that, just pick up any phone book in Kansas. I don't care, any phone book, and call up whoever you throw a dart at it and say, call Jim Jones and ask him about Bob Dole. And I got to believe that most of the time they're going to say, well, that guy works hard. I may not agree with him, but he got there on his own. And secondly, I'll tell you the truth. But I can't do that unless I get elected. And I can't get elected unless I get nominated. And I can't get nominated unless you go to the caucuses. And if I get lucky, or not lucky, it's not luck, if I'm fortunate enough to win the caucuses, if I do well in this state, I want to get on the plane that night headed for New Hampshire, and I want to think to myself, I did it because they believed and they concluded that Bob Dole was one of us. That's what it's all about. You got to have some reason to identify with a candidate. And if you agree that Bob Dole is one of us, then I'm going to win. And if I win in Iowa, I'm going to be hard to stop in the next place, maybe. But I don't want to raise expectations. It's still very close here. It's a very tight race. So I'm going to keep on working and keep on working. And if I can't close the sale with you, I'm going to ask Elizabeth to talk to you. And we make house calls, and we do windows. We do all those things necessary to make certain you understand that we are serious about it. So thank you very much for coming, and Happy New Year.